Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. Hello. Hello. My name is Mike Danielson. I'm a professor here at the NYU Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome you all here this evening for our event and to the Abramson Family Room. So today we're talking about shifting policy in Cuba. On December 17th, D17, which has become universally recognized as shorthand for the date in 2014 when Presidents Barack Obama and Raul Castro appeared on television simultaneously to announce their intentions to restore diplomatic ties and endeavor to normalize relations between the two countries. After 55 years of estrangement and hostility, the two presidents acknowledged that an alternative path based on mutual respect was both possible and desirable. President Obama committed at that time his administration to take a series of executive actions that would loosen the infamous embargo. However, the embargo itself would and does remain in effect as it by law requires an act of Congress to be eliminated. On August 14th of this year, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry traveled to Cuba to see the U.S. flag raised over the embassy there for the first time in more than 5 decades. This symbolically and substantively, I would argue, important moment signified a major shift in relations between the two countries. Since the success of the Cuban Revolution on January 1st of 1959. Yet, as important as the restoration of diplomatic relations is, the relations between the two countries are far from being normal in terms of the way countries typically relate with each other. We talk about normalization, but this is a process rather than an end to which we have arrived. Chief among the remaining barriers, of course, is the embargo itself, and which the U.S. maintains against Cuba, and which, as I mentioned just a moment ago, must be eliminated through congressional action. Just on July 28th, just before the raising of the flag above the embassy in Cuba, Representative Kathy Castor of Florida and Tom Emmer of Minnesota introduced the Cuba Trade Act of 2015 to lift the embargo and allow U.S. business to freely trade with Cuba. In this context of increased normalization, relations between the United States and Cuba, we convene this panel discussion today. So I'm going to start by, as those of you who have seen the announcement of this event know, we're scheduled to have 2 members of Congress here originally. Unfortunately, one of those, Representative Kathy Castor of Florida, is unable to make it due to commitments that sort of emerged out very rapidly in the House of Representatives. Tom Emmer will be joining us at some point during the evening, probably in about 15 minutes. So we're going to do this in a somewhat dynamic way, figure it out as he arrives. We're going to begin a panel discussion right here. Whenever the representative arrives, he will give remarks and take questions from the audience. And whenever he has to leave to return to do some floor votes, some procedural votes later. Then we will return to our discussion of the panel with the panelists up here and take more questions from all of you. So now I'll begin by introducing the 3 panelists, and then I will join them for our discussion. Jason Marshak, who's immediately to my left here, is Deputy Director of the Adrian Arsh Latin American Center at the Atlantic Council, which he joined and helped to launch in 2013. The Arsh Center, with Marshak's co-leadership, has established itself as the go-to center for analysts and insight on New Latin America and its strategic role in the transatlantic community. Marshak frequently provides English and Spanish language commentary on political and economic issues in Latin America, and has written for numerous publications, including CNN, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, the Miami Herald, among several others. He previously served as director of policy at the Americas Society, Council of the Americas, and was a co-founder and senior editor of Americas Quarterly. Prior to that, he was a program officer and founding member of Partners of the Americas Center for Civil Society, and he also served as a legislative aide in the House of Representatives, so he sort of understands a couple of different sides of how policymaking in Washington works, I think you could say. He received his bachelor's degree from Tufts University and his master's in international affairs from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies right here in DC. Next to Jason is Marguerite Jimenez, who's senior policy advisor to the Secretary of Commerce, where she focuses on Cuba and the Western Hemisphere. Prior to joining the Department of Commerce, she served as a White House Fellow, and taught public policy at American University, where I should mention I received my PhD along with Marguerite, and I'm also currently a research fellow at the American University Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. She has an MA in foreign policy and a PhD in government. She has done Cuba-related work for the past decade, traveling to the island a dozen times while leading delegations to Cuba for the Council of Foreign Relations, directing study abroad programs in Havana, and most recently traveling to Havana with the Commerce Secretary. She's also a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And finally, on the far left, literally, maybe if not figuratively, is Mark Hansen, who is Senior Associate for Cuba at the Washington Office on Latin America. He's a leading expert on U.S. foreign policy and international assistance and leads WOLA's Cuba policy. Prior to joining WOLA in 2013, he led Refugee International's Colombia program and government relations. Before that, he covered foreign policy, economics, budget, and tax policy as a legislative assistant to Congressman Sam Farr of California, who, as it turns out, used to be my representative when I lived there. In this capacity, he worked to rebalance U.S. Foreign assistance to Colombia, expand funding for civil society in Mexico, and improve relations with Cuba, among other things. He has a degree from Santa Clara University in political science and philosophy, and I guess in interest of full disclosure, I have a degree from Santa Clara University as well, and Mark was my good friend from way back then. And he also has a master's degree in urban planning from the University of California, Los Angeles. So now, as I'm the person introducing at the podium, but I'm also the person who's moderating down on the chairs, I'm going to move there, switch my mics, make sure this thing goes on, and we're going to start. Green. That's good. It works. The magic of technology. Okay, good. So what I'd like to do to sort of begin this discussion is that to set the stage, I think it makes sense to look at the Cuba side. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about sort of what's happening here in the United States, what it looks like from here in terms of policy development, but it makes sense to begin talking about what's happening in Cuba, what has been happening in Cuba, how can we understand that, how do we interpret that, and what we're going to do is have each of our panelists discuss a range of different issues, and with this issue on sort of what's been happening in Cuba, what are some of the key adjustments and reforms being undertaken by the Raul Castro government, and what does this mean for Cuba's development, US-Cuba relations, as well as what the impact of the embargo has been. And I'd like to begin with you, Jason.
Thank you. Is this technology working as well? I think it is. Thanks. And actually, thanks for the introduction. Actually, also in the interest of full disclosure, is actually my bio says U.S. House of Representatives, but it's actually Congressman Sam Farr as well. So Mark and I actually separated by how many years, Mark?
Maybe 6
5 or 6 years, but we held a similar position. So that just so that's out there in full disclosure as well. So it's great, Mark, to be on the panel with you and Marguerite as well. And thanks for having us, and thanks to NYU. I think just beginning, I think that one of the if people are learning about Cuba from the get-go, and they say, look at all these different reforms that the United States has done in the last since December, and they say, well, why aren't the Cubans reciprocating? Why aren't the Cubans moving as fast as the United States is moving? And I think part of the response to that question is because the Cubans don't want to move fast. The Cubans' fast change for a country that has been under the leadership of two brothers since 1959 is not the country that wants anything to be moving fast, right? And so I think that as we look at reforms in Cuba, we need to have patience, and that's I think one of the keys is that look, for 54 years. The relationship was largely restricted except for some notable ups and downs during administrations. And so the Cubans need some time to adjust to this, and they also need to do it in a way that it doesn't, for their sake, for the leadership's sake, doesn't upend the model that they have put in place. This is what they're looking at, right? And so, I think also it's important to take note that you've seen a lot of interest in Cuba's commercial potential since the president's executive actions last December. And I think a lot of that is some of that's warranted. A lot of it's completely overblown, right? There's a lot of euphoria about this incredible market in Cuba. But look, it's a market of 11 million people with a $20 is your average monthly salary. GDP is about 77 billion. It's basically on par with West Virginia or the Salt Lake City metro area. So there are opportunities in Cuba when it comes to agriculture, tourism, telecommunications, energy, infrastructure, pharmaceutical, but this is not a huge new consumer class. And the Cubans have made a variety of adjustments to try to better attract investment. Last year, there was a new foreign investment law that was put in the books to attract greater foreign capital. It cuts taxes on profits by half to 15%, exempts companies from paying taxes for the first 8 years of operation. But the question is to what degree has this been a success, and to what degree have other things like the economic zone at the Mariel port been a success? I think that the Mariel zone, the Cubans had a lot of, they were staking a lot on companies coming in and taking advantage of the economic opportunities there, and there has been some momentum, but there hasn't been nearly the kind of momentum that the Cubans expected. And so this is a policy they need to double down on. With also impeding economic transformation, or better saying economic investment in Cuba, is the dual currency system that continues, right? And so there's two different currencies. There's the CUC if you're a foreigner and dealing with foreign-based transactions, and then there's the national peso if you're average Cuban, buying rice at the ration store, and so that makes working in two different currencies makes it very difficult for foreign businesses to be able to come in and invest in Cuba. And so this is something that the Cubans have talked about. There's been a lot of speculation for I don't know how many years that there would be unification of the dual currency system. The speculation now that this might happen by the end of this year or Q1 of next year. But I think it's really, you never know what's going to happen in Cuba until it really happens. You can have all the speculation you want, but it's impossible to know until then. But I think, Mike, going back to your question as well, I think the changes on the island are also partly influenced by a fear from the Cubans of another special period, right? And the special period was, this time when after the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cuban economy went haywire, right? There was they lost their major benefactor, and things were really bad in Cuba for much of the 1990s. Now, the Cubans have learned their lesson from that, and they've tried to not become overly dependent on one particular country for their financial longevity. But at the same time, Venezuela has become incredibly important to Cuba. It provides nearly 2/3 of its oil. It gives Cuba preferential supplies of 100,000 barrels per day of oil. And if you follow issues in Latin America or whatnot, globally, you'll know that things in Venezuela are pretty bad, and they're getting worse and worse and worse. I mean, the Venezuelan economy is expected to contract by 10%, which is the worst of any country in the world, over 200% inflation. And so this is a country that the Cubans increasingly recognize that they cannot be dependent upon. And so I think that that's the economic movement that we have in Cuba, the reforms in Cuba are partly governed by this fear of an over-dependence on certain powers. I'll throw the Chinese in there as well, because the Chinese have been incredibly important for the Cubans. Although I don't think the Chinese are going anywhere, but especially on the Venezuelan front. And there's a bunch of things that have happened since. Tell me if I can.
Okay.
There's a bunch of things that have happened since December of 2014. Besides the embassies reopening and the diplomatic relations, but at the same time we've seen some interesting things as well. There's been a decrease in food product or agricultural commodity purchases since the announcement. There's been an increase in healthcare purchases, but then we've also seen things like authorizing the direct correspondent banking account with Stonegate Bank, which is the bank now for the embassy. Roaming agreement with Verizon Wireless. We've seen the introduction to Cuba of Airbnb, and the Cubans have done nothing to throw that operation off. They begin the discussion of reestablishment of regularly scheduled commercial service, agreement to resume postal negotiations. So there's been a lot of things have happened, and there's been more things have happened on the U.S. side. The question is to what degree the Cubans will reciprocate, right? Well, to what degree will the Cubans themselves allow, the use of credit cards? To what degree will they allow for operational presence of U.S. businesses? To what degree will they allow for U.S. businesses to engage in, loan and lease programs to license independent businesses? So there are a lot of things that have been pushed for on the U.S. side. The Cubans are analyzing everything and being, I think, very cautious in their reaction.
All right, good. Marguerite, you want to?
Hard to add to that. So the one thing I would say is just, I think from the Cuban leadership, at least when the secretary traveled, she was very well received. So I think there's a lot of enthusiasm on the part of the Cubans in terms of being very, very open to this kind of new chapter, and people, especially within the kind of senior leadership level, being really open to engagement and really open to kind of establishing a new foundation, new working relationships, and this awareness that there's frustration on the Cuban side, obviously, about things like the embargo, about Guantanamo, and so starting with those issues, but also being really willing to work on areas of mutual interest. I think there's also, Cuba has for kind of the existence of the revolutionary government has been kind of under this constant threat from the United States. Mm-hmm. And so I think part of the wariness on their side at this point is, if you're used to the United States having been this existential threat for 50 years, and that's all, 70% of the Cuban population born, after the revolution, and that's all you've known. For us in the United States to kind of expect that, like, oh, well, now we want to make nice, is we have to temper our expectations as far as that's concerned. And I think starting off with a lot of the kind of relationship building that I think is happening right now, especially as you'll see the Department of Homeland Security is sending a delegation down later this week. You'll see Tom Vilsack with agriculture going down in November. So these kind of government to government relationship building, I think, is a really crucial thing that's going on, and I think is really is being well received and having an effect on the island. But further than that, I won't add.
All right, well, Mark?
Yeah, so I think that most of the major sort of structural changes and economic changes, a lot of them have been already enumerated, and I think that what I'll do is I'll try to draw some focus on just a couple of things that I think are going on that are interesting questions into the future. One thing that WOLA pays a lot of attention to, and my colleague Jeff and Anne are here with us today. One of the things that we're looking at is the independent sector in Cuba. So there's this private sector that's growing, supposedly 400, 500,000 participants in it. They are the owners of the private restaurants, the owners of bed and breakfast, some cooperatives in the ag sector, some private drivers. If you've been to Cuba, you've probably interacted and participated directly in the Cuban private sector. And that's one thing I think that's sometimes lost is the importance of this new private sector. As small as it may be, it is emerging and it's new. It's 5 years old, if that, in the current state. And so as we think about our own policy making, what's important to understand is that there is an independent sector there. It's alive and well, and what's interesting is that Cubans themselves are no longer entirely dependent on the state. And so there's a very new relationship. And I think we have Ricardo, an economist from Cuba, in the audience, and I think he said it in a really nice way at a recent lunch we had, which was the way that Cubans are attaching themselves to the Cuban economy are changing and are in flux. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about as we think about the changes in Cuba. Certainly the growth in travel to Cuba is fueling that private sector. It's also adding resources to the state coffers as well. And so we'll see what that means. But we've also seen some other changes that happened here that allowed for changes in Cuba to take place. And some of that is the remittances and the travel back and forth. And the connection between Cubans here in the United States and Cubans in Cuba, and the fact that the Cuban government has allowed for remittances to come relatively freely, has allowed people to use their resources relatively freely, and has allowed for commercial transaction between individuals, i.e. either selling their real estate or selling houses or otherwise having transactions in the service sector. It's created a dynamic where we're starting to see some inequalities that are emerging based on those remittance flows going to some sectors of the Cuban society, but not all. And it's highlighting the inability of the state to catch up and use its safety net to balance that inequality. And I think going forward, as we watch some of the changes going on in Cuba, what will be interesting to pay attention to is what the state does to, A, collect taxes on the private sector that it's allowing, and facilitating the maintenance of a social safety net that can help to balance some of the inequalities that we're beginning to see. And so those are the questions that we're trying to take a look at WOLA and that we're paying attention to going forward.
Can I just add?
Yeah, I was going to invite you to, actually.
Okay. Yeah. No. So we said before the panel we were going to try and disagree with each other to try and make us this interesting. The problem is I can't disagree with you, Mark, on this. So I just want to further highlight, I think, Mark's two excellent points. So I'm doing far from disagreeing with you.
Right.
But one is the issue.
What I can do.
Yeah, exactly. One is the issue of the private sector, right? And this it's great that you brought that up because this was one of the chief reasons for the U.S. engagement for the president's engagement with Cuba. All of the different executive actions that we saw in September and we saw in December is the premise behind this, and the way the administration is talking about the importance of these actions. It's about helping this nascent private sector to further grow, right? And so this is the chief reason behind the president's policies. And it's also, why is that important? Well, helping this private sector grow also helps to then present another voice of importance on the island, right? Because right now, before the private sector, or 5 years ago, there was only one voice, and that was the government, right? And now, as you've seen, restaurateurs and others become economically successful and have increasing clout in society because of their economic effectiveness, that gives a greater kind of counterweight to the government. So I think that's important to highlight. And this issue of inequality is critical as well, because Mark didn't say it, but the inequality is really with the Afro-Cuban population. So the issue is that you have largely it's the white Cubans that fled to Miami and are the ones that are sending remittances back to Cuba, and the remittances that thereby go largely to the white Cuban population. And then you have the Afro-Cuban population that largely, I'm being very general here, but that has largely stayed on the island. And those people, and have for all these years have just like those others on the island, the white Cuban population, but have believed in the revolution, and the revolution is all about equality among the different sectors of the population. And so these remittances are really creating this social inequality that's also turned into very much a racial inequality issue as well. And so that kind of threatens the fundamental nature of what the Cuban state really is, insofar as being able to provide that type of equality across society.
I would just add one thing just on the issue of private sectors, and not at all disagreeing, but just I think that the issue of the emerging private sector also points out one of the biggest, I think, challenges for the Cuban government at this point is that the Cuban government doesn't, at this point, really know how to, doesn't have any experience, for example, like running wholesale markets to kind of support a private sector that's emerging kind of as quickly, I think, as Cuba's private sector is emerging. So in order for, and it's one of the areas where I think you see our regulations not having as much of an impact on the island, is because, for example, in order for a contractor or someone who's engaging in, kind of refinishing houses or something in Cuba, in order for them to actually be able to operate in the private sector and to be able to build their business, they also need access to, building supplies. And so we're seeing this kind of disconnect between our regulations on the one hand allowing things for the first time, but then on the other side, they're not necessarily, there being issues in terms of just kind of our regulations not necessarily speaking to the reality in Cuba that we're happy to be exporting things, yet not really realizing, oh right, all of our exports have to go through a Cuban government entity in order for that to actually make it into Cuba. So we're just seeing, I think, even more kind of just additional challenges that relate to the Cuban private sector and how the Cuban government's responding.
Would you refer to that as institutional development or the need to develop certain institutions in order to?
Yeah, and I think it's something that the Cuban government, Cuban leadership has been very frank about, that's, it's not an area where they have decades of experience, and that this is, figuring out new regulatory schemes and tax policy. It's, they're doing this kind of as an experiment, and as one Cuban government official said, it's an experiment that they can't really afford to get wrong. And so there's a high cost to some of these policies, and kind of seeing how they move forward is going to be, I think, a big waiting game for us.
But I think it's important to also acknowledge that it may be policy reforms that they can't get wrong, but it's also unclear how much they want to get them right. I mean, what's obvious is that they need some sort of credit market to do a whole host of things, and whether or not the government's going to release and allow for a big private credit market is kind of unknown, and I don't think they necessarily want to go there. But, Sarah Kenoshan, who works at WOLA, is trying to book hotel rooms, and there's apparently this massive glut of people wanting to go to Cuba, and there's not enough room for people. Right. But are they welcoming foreign capital to do development projects on a sort of a slightly less regulated pace, or are they making everything go through an highly centralized economy? I think it's the latter. And so they aren't sort of fully pursuing this host of reforms necessarily either, and I think because there's this tension between their interest in maintaining control as well as their interest in introducing some dynamism and some independent initiative into the economy. And I don't know where the line is on, or I don't know that the Cuban government has a particular idea where that line is. Another area where we see that tension between kind of the old Cuba and the new Cuba is the role of the church in society. Over the time that I've been visiting Cuba, you've seen the Catholic Church and other churches emerge as major, maybe not major, but very important cultural touchstones that are now allowed to welcome in public school kids after school to do lessons and planning and allow them to get educated both in the faith but also in numeracy. They have computer labs. They do a lot of interesting things at some of these centers, but it's unclear whether or not they're going to truly blow the lid off and allow the churches to play a more active role and have full education, because there's also it's pretty fundamental to the belief system of the government that the state educates. And so will they allow private actors to play a more fundamental role in the education system? And I don't think they are. So I think it's right that they're trying to get it right and they're trying to work through some things, but there's clearly a contestation about how far they're going to go as well. And so it's not simply the policy precision, it's also whether or not there's political will behind some of these things.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And they clearly need help too. I mean, one of the things that we advocate in the Atlantic Council is greater engagement with the international financial institutions, right? And that the IDB or the World Bank, but our perspective is that the IDB would be more likely to be able to come in and be able to help Cuba, because the World Bank, joining the World Bank for Cuba means joining the IMF. And there is no, that's, I think, very far-fetched that the Cubans would have any desire to join the IMF. But to join the IDB, you have to be a member of the OAS. And I think as long as if they're interested in becoming a member, the invitation is out there. The problem becomes on the U.S. side, right? Because there are many different, not only Helms-Burton, there are a variety of different pieces of legislation that impede Cuban membership in these institutions. And I think some of this has to be tested, right? Because There are instructions that our executive director could not vote for Cuban membership, for example, in the IDB. But there is nothing that he or she couldn't abstain from voting. The problem is the fact that it's written into law that any money that's spent by the IDB, for example, on Cuban issues, is then subtracted from the amount of money the U.S. puts into the IDB. But I think there are certain things that Cuba has shown a greater interest in further engagement. It's a member of the CAF and further interest in working with the CAF and the Andean Development Bank, and so which generally does more infrastructure type issues, but there are opportunities for working on the financial side. But I think the international financial institutions, and you've seen this in the world, right? I mean, even places like Albania or places like Vietnam, where the EFIs went into these countries before they were actually members to be able to provide some support through technical missions. And this will be critical, I think, this point on the dual currency system, right? The Cubans don't know how do they unify the currencies in a way that it doesn't completely throw off the entire economy.
Yeah. Well, we could spend the whole time here talking about Cuba and what's happening inside of Cuba, and I had another question, but I want to move on, since we also want to talk about what is happening in the United States and the policy changes that are happening here. And I think in your answers in our discussion, we'll be able to circle back around and talk again about the implications for Cuba. And you are all certainly invited to ask questions about more detailed questions, or make points about what's actually happening in Cuba, how you view continuity, change, adjustment, reform, whatever you want to call it, what's happening. But I want to move on to the U.S. side. I've divided it into two pieces, sort of what the administration is doing and can do via executive action. I'm going to start there, and later we'll talk about the legislative question and Congress. But I guess I want to go to Marguerite now, since as a representative of the U.S. government from the Department of Commerce, we just went to Cuba on a trip representing with the Secretary of Commerce. Give us the lay of the land, or talk about some of the key changes that have happened over the last, I guess, 10 months or so since the December 17th announcement.
So steering clear of the specifics of some of the regulatory changes.
Sure.
And I'll speak mostly from the commerce perspective. I know there's some folks from state in the room as well. If other folks want to weigh in and getting other opinions. Mm-hmm. I think the mood right now in terms of engagement across agencies, I think you're seeing that play out. So like with commerce, for example, issuing updates to regulations, making it easier to engage in certain forms of trade and travel has been kind of the fundamental aspect, and really trying to make it easier to engage on a whole variety of levels, whether or not that's commercial transactions, whether or not that's people-to-people travel, whether or not it is having businesses be able to explore in very preliminary ways. Mm-hmm. I think with the executive orders and what can be done with executive authority, I want to be cautious there, because there's definitely differing opinions.
About what can be done, you mean?
Yeah, what can be done, what has been done, what should be done, how much further can you go?
Uh-huh. Right.
Within the confines of what has been done already, the president has obviously said that he wants to see the embargo lifted. Mm-hmm. So supporting that, and then the next question is, okay, well, how do you actually create policy that supports that view? And so some of the policies that have been changed in order to increase support for the Cuban people, from the Cuban side, I think are viewed as kind of being insufficient, right? So it's you want to lift the embargo, but at the same time you don't want to trade with any, or you don't want to do business with anyone or with the Cuban government on any issue other than telecom, for example. So it's a hard message to get for on the Cuban side, and you'll definitely hear the opinion in Cuba that the regulatory changes haven't gone far enough, and so without getting into the legal aspects of that. I think the administration is still looking for ways that for things that can be done to either kind of deepen the existing regulatory changes and to make transactions easier, and is also looking for kind of beyond just deepening what exists, is looking for new kind of places where there's some wiggle room, but also being very, very cautious, and I think caution is kind of the tone in a lot of agencies of not wanting to get out ahead of of some of the people who control our budgets is just a reality of it. But so there's great work being done. State is doing great work in terms of building on areas of mutual interest, right? Whether or not that's drug trafficking, whether or not it's immigration, it's the environment, it's doing stuff on human rights, and so really building on areas of mutual interest. And then Commerce recently, when the secretary was down earlier in October, kicked off a regulatory dialogue, for example, that's really intended to find out more about the Cuban economy, and in order to make our regulations more effective, right? So if we don't know, for example, if we don't understand how the Cuban import-export market actually works, then we write these regulations essentially blindly, which I think has, in all fairness, not speaking from the Department of Commerce's perspective, I think that's kind of what has happened and to a certain extent, is that it's really hard to write regulations that are going to have the maximum effect in Cuba if we haven't talked to the Cubans for a really long time. And so this idea of kind of basic fact-finding, and I think there's a lot of openness to that, as I said earlier, the kind of different trips that are going down, of people just wanting to get to know what's going on and getting to to actually establish working relationships so that we have official government-to-government relationships. So I think you'll continue to see more of that, and hopefully more aggressive outreach from some of our executive agencies related to the embargo.
Right, very good. I guess I'm going to go over to Mark now. You want to have something to add?
I'll dial back. I mean, Marguerite said that she wasn't going to talk about specifics. I'll dial back even further. I think one of the most interesting things that happened with respect to the reforms and the policy changes came with just the tone. The fact that the president is out there saying the embargo is a failed policy and we want to reform it has really driven up, and then they put in place a whole host of actual real reforms coming out of those declarations that have inspired a lot of private sector actors in the United States to begin to develop more expertise and understanding about what's going on in Cuba. And I think that the Cubans are overwhelmed with the number of people and visits from the number of sectors, and I think that the agencies themselves are maybe not getting as much feedback from the private sector because the private sector actors from the U.S. side aren't seeing real clear lines of where their return on investment is in Cuba right now. And it's partially because the Cubans are sort of grappling with this. Again, referencing a statement that Ricardo made around how many big contracts with a major Fortune 500 company have the Cubans drafted in the last 50 plus years. I think it's around zero. Rounding up, it might be zero. I mean, it's none. It's like they just haven't done it. So there's a lot of learning on both sides. And so the clarity that agencies might be looking for, that the private sector has in the United States can help with in many other instances, can't do right now in Cuba, but are growing probably more capable of doing such things because they're down there nearly constantly doing fact-finding, looking for markets, meeting with the Cuban officials and trying to understand the lay of the land. And I think that over time we'll start to see that transform itself into energy and manifest itself into clearer policy guidance for the agencies to then decide whether or not they want to move them forward.
We hosted former Commerce Secretary Carlos Gutierrez a few months ago, and he said something that I think is very evident is the fact that for businesses to have sustained interest in Cuba, the Cubans need to let them make a profit, right? And this is critical.
Simple
and critical. And I'm not sure if the Cubans really, the whole idea of foreign businesses coming in and making a profit in their country is a difficult concept to grasp. But in the end, that's what you need for sustained business investment in Cuba. I think even kind of looking on the U.S. side as well, I think one of the interesting things that we've seen, since December, and then the new regulations put out in September as well, is what's been the response from the American people on this, right? And one of the things that we polled about 10 months before the president's executive actions to look specifically at a lot of different issues that he could different issues at which he can take executive actions on, and found overwhelming support across the country. Not only for reestablishing diplomatic relations, but for doing specific things like talking with the Cubans about immigration issues or energy issues or human trafficking and all the whole range of things in which the U.S. and the Cubans are talking. But everywhere from that to the travel ban and the embargo. And what's happened in the last 10 months is we've taken a policy that has been held captive by a small contingent of congressmen and senators who largely live in South Florida, except for Bob Menendez in New Jersey. And we made this, because rather than being their issue, we made this an American issue. And I think that's what's critical. And as you see across the board, that's given I think a lot of the cover for the president to have made more additional executive actions, and for this continued momentum, right? Because there's been a very positive reaction across the country, and from many members of Congress as well, in regard to the actions that have been taken thus far. I think that we're in the midst of an election season, so it's questionable what type of action we can continue to see moving forward, but at least in the next year or so. But I think largely the response from the American people has been overwhelmingly positive.
I guess I want to shift now to the elephant in the room, or the 100-pound gorilla, or whatever, the embargo itself. The fact that this, as I said in my opening remarks, is something that cannot be changed without an act of Congress, requires congressional action, and any observers of Congress know, not to sort of foreshadow too much, Congress doesn't tend to act in the United States. Period. So, that said, there is legislation on the table to eliminate the embargo. There are Republican and Democratic representatives in the House of Representatives that are on board, that are, doing the heavy lifting to make that happen. So I guess I want to understand, and I'll start with Mark. So why does this policy continue to be supported by some, and it's opposed, though, by a growing number of lawmakers? So why is that? Is that true? Is this change that we're seeing, as Jason said, in the country and in the way the administration talks about this policy, is it perceptible in Congress? You work with members of Congress a lot.
So,
what do you see?
Yeah, so I think I think by the end of, if not this Congress, by the next Congress, the embargo will be gone. I don't think it's sustainable. It's not reflected in the general population. Increasingly special interests, moneyed interests are engaged, though they've been incredibly slow and inadequate in their engagement with Congress. The vast majority of private sector actors now are sort of against it. I think, citing just one poll, there's a Pew poll that asked about the trade embargo, and the Pew poll in January had 66% of Americans thought the trade embargo should go. In July, 72% of Americans thought the trade embargo should go. So now we're talking about 3/4 of Americans think the trade embargo should go. And so we're talking about what's the holdup. And there is a disconnect between the general population and Congress, and I'll come back to that. But looking beneath the numbers in that Pew poll, what you found was conservative Republicans were the fastest growing group who opposed the embargo, moving from 40% in January to 55% in July. From January to July, there were no conservative Republicans out there banging the drum to end the embargo. So that just changed because Cuba's on people's minds. And I think this loops back to the disconnect between Congress and the American people. The more people contemplate our policy towards Cuba, the less sense it makes. And so really what they've relied on, the people who've wanted to maintain the status quo, is low interest levels and some apathy around really wanting to dive in and make this policy change. And so what we're seeing now is there's overwhelming support among the American people. Interest groups are starting to line up. And now we have this broad array of new Republicans in the House of Representatives who are taking the place of Republicans who, many of which were elected to the Senate from the House. And so just to name off a few, there was in the 109th, 110th, and 11th Congresses, there was a very active and very robust bipartisan working group on Cuba. It was comprised of Jeff Flake, Jerry Moran, John Bozeman, among other Republicans. Some of those Republicans have retired, but those three are now in the Senate. And it's why we're seeing a lot of leadership coming out of the Senate. It's why we saw them strip travel restrictions on the T-HUD appropriations bill. There's some other changes in the financial services appropriations bill. We'll see where it all ends up, because your previous point of Congress not acting is making it so we're going to see a gigantic omnibus appropriations bill, and what gets put into it may have to be the sort of lowest common denominator things, and therefore we won't see anything interesting happen on Cuba, but we'll see about that. In the House side now, what you're seeing what I kind of put the groups that support renovating or altering our Cuba policy and opening it up into a few different boxes. One are the libertarians, the House Freedom Caucus. 3 Congresses ago, the idea that there would be a libertarian movement within Congress that had any impact on a foreign policy or anything else was pretty laughable. There were only a few people who really stepped out on this issue. Now you have 40 members on the Republican in the Republican conference that very much are libertarian and vote their principle and argue their principle routinely. And the libertarian perspective is that they don't think their government has a role in regulating their ability to conduct commerce or to travel freely, and they want to potentially see this go. It's represented in one or a couple of the co-sponsors of the Cuba Trade Act, as well as the Travel Act, in Justin Amash, who's one of the co-founders of the House Freedom Caucus. You have other sets of Republicans who are very much sort of mainstream traditional Republicans on trade and business, and they just want to let commerce go and be unrestrained by any sort of conditions and conditionality. You see that reflected in some of the ag exporters, Charles Bustani, Ralph Abraham. Ralph Abraham, interestingly, his staffer told me that their biggest export market for their chicken and rice is Haiti right now. So they very much have a strong interest in getting to Cuba, which is a more robust market than Haiti. And so you see the libertarian, you see the trade-centric folks, and then you do have a handful of people who think that it's a better foreign policy on the Republican side to not just cede territory, not to disengage with a part of the world that's so close to us, and to in fact begin to develop both commercial as well as cultural ties to then build upon that to see what kind of diplomatic change we can see. So I think we're just beginning to see the House get active. The Senate has already led the way. They have a trade bill in the Senate that actually has up to 46, 47 co-sponsors right now. I think if there was a vote on whether or not to limit the travel ban on Cuba, if it came onto the Senate floor, I think it would pass. I don't know how many votes it would get, but it would be well over 55, probably closer to 60. And then where the House would be, it's playing catch-up, but it's moving in the right direction. So I think now the disconnect is a really interesting thing, and we've come a long ways. When I first started visiting congressional offices, late 2013, early 2014, you ask people and they're like, where's Cuba? What's an embargo? Is it true I can't go to Cuba? Is that still a thing? I mean, really the lack of knowledge was dumbfounding. And over time, it's in the press more, and it's more readily available. More people are talking about it. But still today, it's really striking how many staffers you can walk into and you ask them, where's your boss on these series of bills? No idea. Like, they just don't know where their boss is on a whole host of things. And they haven't been asked or talked to yet and educated. And so there's a big education effort underway to bring offices up to speed about what are the different questions that we should be considering as Cuba Trade Act, as the export bills, as the travel bills are being contemplated. And increasingly, I think as they generate a deeper understanding and as they take on more information, I think they'll move to where the American people are. I think very few offices know that 72% of Americans think the trade embargo should go. I don't think they know that. Very few even know. The Chamber of Commerce has been out there banging this drum for quite a while now. Many offices have no idea that the Chamber has said anything. The Catholic Church, likewise, many, many years working on the moral question of whether or not the embargo has helped the Cuban people, which they've determined it has not, and they want to get rid of it. Many people have no idea that the Catholic Church, until recently when the Pope visited and then came up here, had this stance. And so I think over time we're starting to see a deepening understanding, and with that I think we'll see Congress more sort of be more reflective of their constituents.
Okay. I guess I'll go to you now, Jason.
Yeah, no, I think that, as Mark said, many congressmen couldn't find Cuba on a map probably, a year or so ago, and so, now many can at least find Cuba. But I think that just a couple points. One is the issue of, and I think Mark was alluding to this in the different caucuses and whatnot, Amy, but Cuba is one of the few issues in Congress that's actually, it's a bipartisan issue, right? And I think that's important to point out. This is not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. There are people on both sides of the aisle who are for it and people on both sides of the aisle who are against it, right? More Republicans who are against it because it's being against Obama, so let's be against it. But there are notable Democrats, like I was mentioning before. Bob Menendez, who is against any type of opening with Cuba, and our nominee for ambassador to Mexico, her nomination has been held up because of she had nothing to do with the Cuba the talks that went up to December 2014, but just because she happened to be the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. Rubio and Marco Rubio and others want to have held up her nomination. So it's a political football issue on the Hill, but it remains a bipartisan football issue. I think that insofar as when can we expect any type of change to the embargo? I think you said, Mark, by 20. What was your timeline? The embargo was
by the end of the next Congress.
And the next Congress.
This is on the record, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes.
Mark right here. Mark is making his prediction.
Heard it here first.
You're here first.
I also predict everybody will forget about the prediction well before the prediction has to come true. But
And my prediction is this cannot happen until at least 2018, because in 2018 is when Raul Castro has said he will step down from power, and it's going to be much easier to be able to do away with the embargo when you don't have a Castro as the president of Cuba. And so I think that is a clear. I think that nothing will happen before 2018.
Okay, let me just. It sounded like you said in different words the same thing, but you're saying after the end. Mark's saying that after the end of the next Congress, which will end
I'm saying it. Well, the next.
or 2018. So you're saying after 2020.
I'm saying at least 2018.
It'll take that next.
At least 2018. So don't expect anything. The next Congress will take
Going with
power
160
in 2017. So
You raised him one
I
Congress.
raised him one Congress. And the other interesting thing.
playing it safe, Jason.
Right. But you could win if it's next Congress. So, it also depends on who's in the White House, to be honest, as well, right? I mean, Hillary Clinton made a big speech at Florida International University end of July on Cuba. She would be, incredibly supportive of continuing the president's Cuba policies. On the Republican side, Donald Trump, Rand Paul have come out in support, but others like Marco Rubio are not. But I'm going to stop here because and let a commercial break for our panel.
Good. Okay. Actually, I'm going to just make this go. So now I would like to welcome U.S. Representative Tom Emmer, who has just joined us. Welcome, Congressman. I'll give a couple of brief words. Congressman Emmer is U.S. Representative for Minnesota's 6th Congressional District, and along with Congresswoman Kathy Castor, of Florida, who's unfortunately unable to join us, introduced the Cuba Trade Act of 2015, legislation which would lift the Cuba embargo and allow for business in the private sector to trade freely with Cuba, while prohibiting taxpayer funds to be used for the promotion or development of this new market. So Representative Emmer has been one of the key leaders on this policy, and so please, Congressman, thank you for being here.
Thanks. Good evening. Kathy, I'm disappointed she's not here, and I asked my colleague, I said, "Where's Kathy tonight?" He said, "Oh, emergency whip meeting that the Democrats have for a particular issue," and it just made me smile. So I guess they have issues too. Again, good evening. Thanks to NYU, DC for hosting us tonight. And to the Washington office on Latin America for the invitation to be here. I appreciate it. You already heard my name's Tom Emmer, and I'm a congressman from the great state of Minnesota. Now, after I was sworn in last January, trade was one of the first things that I began working on. Trade to me is not just about our domestic economy. It also plays a large part in our geopolitical strength and our foreign policy goals. Trade plays a critical role by empowering expanding economies and developing nations. Our change in policy toward Cuba will strengthen long-standing relations with our Latin American partners and enable the United States to finally advocate for real change right here in our own hemisphere. A little over a decade ago, after Congress exempted agricultural commodities and medical supplies from the Cuban embargo, Minnesota was one of the first states to develop a trade relationship with Cuba. The limited exemptions to the embargo and the relationships that followed planted the seed for change. The small step, the exemptions, opened the lines of communication between people, businesses, farmers, and governments. These relationships, person by person, have started a larger conversation that ultimately has led us to where we are today. A place where full normalization of relations is not only possible, but inevitable. For far too long, the United States policy in our own hemisphere has been one of isolation. Too often, we've looked past many nations in our own backyard, and as a result, we have paid a heavy diplomatic and economic price. As the economic and social order in Latin America remains fluid, and the economic and security alliances are changing, a shift in our policy will allow the United States to play a role in improving security, economic, and political stability in the region. To me, as well as an overwhelming majority of the American public, it is clear that our policy toward Cuba and the region over the past 50 years is not working. When looking toward what a future US-Cuban relationship looks like, we must ask ourselves a few questions. Are our goals in the Western Hemisphere, and in this case, Cuba, aimed at promoting social and political change? Are we hoping to improve human rights and advance our geostrategic or geopolitical interests? Would we like to continue to open new markets for U.S. exports? If the answer to each of these questions is yes, then it's hard to see how the existing Cuban embargo accomplishes any of these goals. After a recent trip to Havana, it was clear to me that despite a complex history and uncertain future, the United States and our Cuban neighbors are not so different after all. The Cuban people have the same hopes, dreams, and aspirations for a better and more prosperous future, just as we do here in America. That's why at the end of July, joined by Congresswoman Kathy Castor, who has now become a friend from Florida, and 6 of my Republican colleagues, and that number has now grown a bit, the Cuba Trade Act, we introduced the Cuba Trade Act of 2015. The Cuba Trade Act of 2015 is intended to fully lift the embargo with Cuba. It would grant U.S. citizens and businesses the freedom and opportunity to trade with Cuba while protecting U.S. taxpayers from any risks associated with such trade. But those of us who support changing U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere by lifting the Cuban embargo, and there are many, nationwide, 73% of Americans are in favor of restoring a relationship between the United States and Cuba. While there are many of us, support from Republicans, both in Washington and throughout the country, while it is progressing, and by the way, now nearly 60% of Republicans across the country support ending the embargo and reestablishing diplomatic relations, we still have a ways to go. We formed a broad bipartisan coalition to support not only our legislation, but to advocate for a broader change in policy towards Cuba. We've worked to show how this change in U.S. policy will help us achieve our nation's goals, not just Cuba's, not just our nation and Cuba's, but the region as a whole. Despite initial concerns about this, I should say despite my initial concerns, and maybe some that I met with, about how some of my Republican colleagues might react to this proposal, I've received little pushback. Members see the failure of our current policy, and despite warnings from a small group to the contrary, they also see that working toward normalization has already strengthened our position in the region. One of our largest hurdles is the fact that the Cuban government continues to insist on maintaining an unrealistic level of control over both their people and the economic system. I've urged the Cuban ambassador, foreign minister, and Cuban President Raul Castro in private meetings that they must work with us, not against us, in making this a reality. There are many thoughtful and patriotic members of Congress whose families and friends have suffered dearly and experienced loss because of this regime's actions. And we cannot, and we should not, expect them to forget as we move forward to lift the embargo. We must respect their personal experience and their reality. The Castro Revolution and its aftermath has left an indelible stain upon many Cuban American patriots. As we move to lift the embargo and normalize relations, we must be clear that the regime needs to continue to usher in reforms to their private sector, expand political and technological freedoms, and show their political opponents that they're serious. The Cubans must grasp the historical significance of this moment and that our concessions will not be one-sided or used to serve anyone's interests but those of the Cuban people. Congressional opponents of lifting the embargo have every right to be skeptical and show concern. Again, they've experienced loss and pain on a personal level that a guy from a small town in Minnesota could never fully understand. Lifting the embargo cannot be used as a tool to further enrich revolutionaries in the old guard of Cuba's ruling elite. But this skepticism must be married with the reality that the embargo has been and is a failure and has done nothing to advance political and economic freedom in Cuba. The embargo as a policy was instated to isolate the Castros. In the end, it was the United States and the Cuban people who were isolated. As we go forward and continue to draw down our trade, regulatory, and governmental barriers, it's not enough to simply make an economic argument for this change in policy. We must remember that this policy is about more than dollars and cents or a company's ability to improve its bottom line. This policy change must be about bettering the lives of both Cuban and the American people. I've seen here in the United States a readiness and willingness to change. I've seen in the eyes of everyday Cubans their sincere and real desire for a more prosperous and bright future. Our goal here today and in the months and years ahead is to never stop striving to enact policies and laws that feed that insatiable hunger for freedom and the opportunity for a better life. This effort is a substantial step in that direction, I believe. I thank you all again for being here tonight, and I appreciate the invitation. I look forward maybe to doing some question and answer if that's what you want. Thank you.
Yeah, question and answer would be great. I believe there are a couple of microphones going around, so I guess raise your hand if you have a question for the Congressman. I'll give you a few.
Well, if I
Don't be shy.
I sucked all the air out of
There's
the room,
one right
I'd
up here
start.
in the front. There's a question right up here. Put your hand up, please. There you go. And please introduce yourself. And
Yeah, I'm Ricardo Torres, so I'm Cuban. I'm
You
spending...
said Ricardo?
Ricardo.
Nice
Yeah.
to meet you, Ricardo.
Pleased to meet you too as well. So I'm spending this semester at American University, the Center for the Study of Latin American and Latino Studies. And so it was very interesting to me after what you said, that I can hardly find any argument, anything that I can disagree on regarding what you just said. And I would like to highlight towards the end of your speech, when you said that this should be about improving the lives of millions of Cubans, above many other things. But I would like to, also taking into account what the panel said before, I would like to highlight three things that are probably, in my opinion, are very important for you in the United States to understand about what's going on in Cuba. So the first thing is that the numbers might be misleading when it comes to realizing how big and how important the private sector already is in Cuba. So in terms of employment, it's approaching 30% of the total labor force, but I argue that a lot more Cubans are engaged with the private sector one way or the other. And there are two reasons for that. One is that the informal economy is huge in Cuba. And that informal economy is in many ways different from what you can find in other countries in Latin America, because in Cuba it's largely about what you cannot find in the formal market. Not necessarily about drugs or guns trafficking or human trafficking or something like that, but basically about things that are not available on the formal market. You mentioned, the wholesale market is basically non-existent to the private sector. So a lot is traded in the informal economy, but it's basically how they supply, how they source, what they need for their activity. And the other thing is that since, public wages are very low, lots of Cubans, even if they maintain a formal job, attached to the government, they engage in activities of different kinds to secure additional income. And that takes me to the next point, which is, that figure, I agree with you that, the size of the Cuban market is very low, it's very small by any standard. But saying that the wages in Cuba are $20 a month is not precise. Because I would say a majority, above 90% of Cubans have additional sources of income. So the actual purchasing power is not $20 a month. So we have to make a distinction, and probably that's something that you should know here in the United States. Wages is one thing, income is different in Cuba. So, and I would argue that most Cubans make more of their income for all the, by all the sources rather than wages. That's true for both professionals, but also technicians, or most of all the occupations. So the other thing is that even though it is true that Cubans' experience in dealing with foreign multinationals and all that is very limited, but we have to bear in mind that there are already foreign companies working in Cuba, and above 200 of them have been there for more than 25 years, and they've managed, even with the shortcomings and the problems of the Cuban model, they've managed to make a profit. Otherwise, they would have not stayed for so long. And I'm not only talking about very small companies. I'm talking about some of them that are quite important, quite large by international standards. We can think of Sherritt in Canada. We can think about some Spanish hotel chains. They are in many other markets. So if they are in Cuba, it means that they can make a profit. And the third aspect is, and probably this has to do more with the implementation of policies. I very much like what you said about how you could actually draft regulations in the United States so that they have an actual impact in Cuba. So whether we like it or not, the Cuban government is a player in this game. So trying to bypass every time the Cuban government or the Cuban public sector to advance all the goals is unrealistic. It's not going to happen with their approval. If we like it or not, it's another discussion. We can spend days talking about that. Many reasons to like them or not to like them. But this is not going to happen. Whether we like it or not, they're in power in Cuba. So I think trying to do that actually prevents the U.S. government to help and reach out to the Cuban people. So, frankly speaking, I think in many ways also in Cuba, since we don't have lots of data about the private sector, we cannot, unfortunately, conduct surveys openly on the private sector. But we are actually, I think many of us are actually underestimating the impact actual developments in Cuba around the private sector is going to have on the ability or the future model for Cuba. I think a lot is going on. And every passing day, more people from all kinds of backgrounds are feeling empowered. And now they have an opportunity, most of the time, to advance their dreams and their aspirations. So everything we can do to support that, I think, is welcome more than from many other, actors by the Cuban people. So very often in Cuba we tend to refer to two blockades or two embargoes. The one that we have from their own failures of our mother, and the one that we have from the U.S. So we have to suffer on both of them at the same time. And, again, the more we do to change that, I think the more we are reaching out and helping, supporting the Cuban people. Thank you. Sorry about the...
No, it's all right. I guess it's interesting, Ricardo. First, I wouldn't suggest that I know more about your country than you do, because I don't. And I'm not sure what the conversation was before I got here, but I don't think I suggested that you can bypass the government under any circumstance. In fact, I think we have to find a way to respect each other a little bit. I would suggest to you that while there are outside businesses, as I understand it, who have done some business in Cuba, I saw something seriously lacking when I was there, and that's an understanding of what it takes to grow a free market. All right, and others have said that they can maintain a socialist utopia and still have the free market system. The Chinese are the most recent that I would suggest think that model works. You will find out, I believe, that inside of China, it creates the people, once they're given power over their own destiny, they like to exercise that power, and they want more of it. And that's the transition, I think, that happens naturally if it's done right. In this case, I saw a lack of understanding of how you attract capital to grow new projects. And the government's going to have to evolve to understand that when you're talking about real investment, and yeah, you talked about the Spanish hotel chains, there are stories. This is actually something that's going or could work against the Cubans in the short term, because the experience that some of the Spanish hotel chains had, they entered into an agreement to build some new hotels for the tourism industry. And halfway through the building, as I understand it, somebody here probably has better details, the Cuban government decided they were going to change the deal. All right, and that created some stress. It got done, it moved on, but if you look at the future, and what they showed me when I went down, the Minister of Trade sat us down and gave us a book with over 300 projects that they, and the statement was, we just need U.S. capital. Well, I will tell you, from my standpoint on the investment side, there are two questions that an investor is going to ask before they give you capital. One, will my money be safe? And that generally is there a rule of law that is enforceable, right? Will my money be safe? And second, can I get a reasonable rate of return on my investment? Those are the two biggest questions. And until there's comfort on the one side that you can do this, I mean, we got to lift the embargo, right? Because you can't even get to that point until you lift the embargo. But as soon as we do that, then the pride on both sides of this negotiating table, they're going to have to be tempered a little bit, right? Because we're both going to have to learn from each other. And I think on the Cuban side, it doesn't just happen because you lift the embargo. You have to show how the investment is safe. Why would you want to invest in Cuba? And yes, you can realize a reasonable return on your investment. So, again, I agree with you. I don't think you go around the government. I think the embargo was designed to destabilize the government, and all it's done is make the government stronger, and frankly, it's worked to the detriment of both Americans and Cubans.
Other questions? Up top.
Will Amatruda, it's no secret to anyone here that there are people, both former Cuban nationals and American multinational corporations, that have financial claims against the Cuban government. I think we would all benefit from a 2-minute tutorial on where these claims lie, how large they are, and how it's going to affect potential normalization of relations?
Well, it is a good question, Will, and I would say from my standpoint, it's not even a 2-minute tutorial. It's you've got displaced Cubans and their descendants now, Cuban Americans who lay claim to certain property that they lost as a result of the revolution. There are companies that claim they lost ongoing businesses and property as a result of the revolution. Those, as I understand it, I've talked to the State Department, those negotiations are ongoing. And on the Cuban side, President Castro and the foreign minister and others will tell you that they also have claims that they say are the direct result of an illegal and improper embargo. In the meantime, we still have an embargo that, frankly, is hurting both Americans and Cubans. I think you got to lift the embargo and have those discussions ongoing and figure out how you resolve it. I don't think that should stand in the way, however, of lifting the embargo. That's my personal belief. By the way, over our history, our world's history, you have regularly had changes in governance through revolution or other means, and you've had these issues outstanding in many different circumstances, including in this country. And it's an issue, there's no question. But if we use that as the reason not to lift the embargo, what do we risk? We risk the opportunity, one, that we can make a significant difference in the lives of 11 million Cuban people by empowering them, and two, we risk our national security in the Western Hemisphere. Frankly, by turning our eyes away from Cuba, what's the alternative? Will they seek help from Putin? Will they seek help from North Korea? Is that what we want in this hemisphere? I think this country, we've spent a lot of time focusing on the Mideast and Asia when we've got to start focusing our eyes right here in our own backyard first. And Cuba's part of that. And I think it's a key to it.
Question up top. Go ahead. Sure.
Since it is NYU, I thought I would ask, what is the status of the fugitive from New York, New Jersey, who apparently was a cop killer, and who's in Cuba for 30 years and basically thumbing their nose at America? And I wondered, are there other cases like that where there are fugitives who have escaped to Cuba and are not being returned for justice?
Yeah, the Castro government is harboring a number of fugitives to this day who have caused harm to American citizens and on U.S. soil. Jason, is it 30? Are they about 30? Do you know the number? It's higher. Those discussions are part of this. In fact, those are probably the more substantive discussions. When I met Raul Castro, that was one of the discussions that we had was you're going to have to do something about that issue, as well as there are some people that are currently incarcerated as well. We believe wrongfully that the Castro regime should look at releasing. And I think the discussion was that will go a long way towards helping us with the movement to lift the embargo. If they will make those concessions earlier rather than later, it would help us dramatically. So far, though, no, there's no movement on that. There's just talk.
Mark.
I actually, I have two questions actually. One, some of the responses that you get when you talk to member offices and members of Congress is the Cubans should have to make some concessions before the U.S. makes concessions and opens up for trade. You know, I think there's a lot of ways to argue, as you have, I think, very eloquently, that there is no concession when you open up trade and travel. That's not a concession on the part of the United States. That's good policy for the United States, and quite honestly, it helps to facilitate the types of changes that people might want to call concessions on the Cuban side. So I'd be curious if you hear that from your colleagues and how you respond. And then the second question is, as you're having conversations in Congress, I hazarded a completely ill-informed guess before you arrived about why is there a disconnect between the 75% of Americans who want to see the trade embargo lifted and the smaller number of people who are currently signatories to your bill?
Well, first off, am I hearing if people don't want to support something, they'll find any reason not to support it, right? So if I go talk to a fellow member and they say, well, I think that the fugitives should be released first, or I think we should resolve this property dispute before we do anything further, I have to respect that. I have to, which is one of the reasons I put in this talk tonight. These are good people. You know, they feel as though I work with Carlos Curbelo, who was telling me how a relative was tortured and perhaps even murdered by the Castro regime. You know, that is something that's very personal to these people, and we can't forget that, and we've got to acknowledge that it's real, and we've got to respect them. But again, you have to bring it back to the Cuban people, and you have to bring it back to our national defense. I mean, if you want to put up an obstacle, I can find a reason to put an obstacle up to anything that you give me. But at some point, you got to sit down, take a deep breath, and ask, what are we trying to accomplish? Are we trying to push Cuba out of the Western Hemisphere? Because the island's not moving. It's going to stay right where it's at. You know, how are you going to help foster what it is that you're seeking to accomplish? Which is again, I think even those people who have lost family members or who have lost property, if they're being sincere, it's about the Cuban people. All right, so let's start with that. And so far, I will tell you, nobody has objected to me, and it's been interesting, Mark, because I've told you, I don't know why I feel as though I'm being treated a little differently than others who have come before me, but I'm not getting that kind of pushback. I'm getting more of, yeah, I know, but, you know, as soon as you get it to the floor, I'll be there with you. Well, no, it's not going to work that way. You're going to have to step up. You're going to have to put your name out there, and people are going to have to know that you stand with them. Plus, when you think about it, the disconnect. So 76% of Americans look at this, and it's common sense. I mean, they look at it and they say, if you've done any work in the most minor area of Cuban American history, right? Okay, so as of this month, it's been 54 years since the embargo was put in place. We've gone through 11 presidents. If it was ever going to have worked, it should have worked in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed and the large subsidies that were propping up sugar and other things supporting the Cuban government, after that all went away and the Cuban people were literally starving and suffering. You would think that if the embargo was ever going to have a chance to have worked in the way it was originally intended, that's when it would have worked. And it didn't. In fact, it simply empowered the Castros and Ricardo. You used a little of the language. You know, when you said we have two blockades, and, you know, one is the U.S., well, it allowed a very charismatic leader to wag the finger at the U.S. and say, it's not our fault that you're suffering. They're the ones that are doing it to you. I mean, I think it was Pope John Paul who said that embargoes really work to harm the people they're meant to help the most. We got to start talking that way. And people who are disconnected, I will tell you, I had a call doing this other thing that I do, the other part of the job where you dial the phone and you say, hi, how are you? You know, looking for support, right? And I talked to a guy down in Florida who's been helpful in the past in a business context, and he said, and I think your position on Cuba is absolutely, you know, I won't use the term. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, because the Castros are bad people, they've done bad things, and they've been doing awful things to the people. I said, all right, well, let's turn it around. Because I'm not going to hear, you know, I know all that history, and I'm not going to judge. It's where are we going? You know, what do you seek to accomplish? And I said, the embargo continues to harm the people, despite they keep clawing their way out of this thing. And it's amazing when you go down there and you see the private concerns, the palladars. You know, I met a gal who, she's in her mid-20s, and I think you heard me tell the story. These guys haven't, but she started a business designing and sewing infant and toddler clothing, right? And we go see her place. Her and her husband have just moved into a nice two-story redone place. I think it even had newer utilities in it. And Don Byer from Virginia, his wife Megan was with us, and I'm standing there and we're talking to her, and Megan Byer says to this young entrepreneur, this young lady, "So what do you see happening if the embargo gets lifted? Would you like to see that?" She goes, "Yes, because I'd like to be able to sell my stuff in the U.S. And you know what? Because if I can sell more, it means I can hire more people, I can make more, I can sell more, I can make more money, and I can buy more things." And of course, that's, the empowerment, right? But the guy in Florida, getting back to him, the guy in Florida, I told him it's about that, number one, empowering the people to be able to self-determine, to reach their full potential, right? But then I also talked to him about the national security thing. I said, "Really? You want Kim Jong-un or you want Putin or somebody else to fill that void if we're not willing to do it?" I mean, you're going to have a change in leadership in Cuba. 2018, Raul Castro is going to step down. All right, there will be a period of instability. You define it. I don't think like wild instability, but whenever there's a change, there's going to be some instability. And I think that it makes sense that the U.S. is there, supportive, not trying to tell people how they are supposed to live, but supportive. I mean, we do better when we show people by example than when we show up and tell them that this works for us and therefore it should work for you. I got done and this guy down in Florida said, "Oh, well, maybe we should talk further." So I think it's really, when they have the disconnect, you got to go to both the people and the national security interest for me. And selfishly, it's also about this country. We need future markets for our produce, for things that we create. Why not an island of 11 million people, a country of 11 million people? It's only 90 miles off our Florida coast. Just makes sense.
More questions?
Yes. Is it on?
Oh.
Yes. Congressman, I hope you succeed in lifting the embargo. I was just down in Cuba. I spent a month. I went with people to people, and then I stayed 2 weeks on my own traveling. I've heard about Cuba for 40 years. I had a Cuban stepfather who was very anti-Castro. And I'd heard met a lot of Cubans throughout my life and loved them. And I love the Cubans. When I was down there, they are such proud people. They're warm and generous. I stayed in Casa Particulares. I ate at the Veres Paradores. And a lot of them spoke English. They were so hospitable. I also was very impressed that I believe since 1993, everything is organically grown. Now, I know the state you're from, and I understand about the agriculture and the growth here, but I'd hate to see that destroyed. There's such beautiful land there, and I would hate to see big corps like Monsanto and others go in and destroy this. It's a pristine, beautiful country, and there is so much unbelievable natural medicines down there with the plants and just a rich earth, and also the beautiful ocean that is around that's pristine as well. And I do think we should have trade in Cuba, but I think it should be slow, and I think it should be very respectful of what they have protected.
No, I can't argue with you. I would only say this to you. First, I prefer to leave that to the Cuban people. They can make that decision. That's not for me or you to tell them what they should do with the island once the embargo is lifted. That's up to them. I will also suggest that it was one of the great sources of hardwoods. A couple hundred years ago, and it was clear cut for sugarcane. And I will tell you that the government has tried all kinds of things. One of the assistant foreign ministers was telling me that they have this really generous program trying to attract people into agriculture, and they just haven't been able to do it. And so, to your point, there should always be a balance. We should always find that balance, but I prefer, it's up to the Cuban people to decide what that balance is.
Well, it's very interesting because we spent more than half of a day at one of the agricultural co-ops, and the people there were so happy, and they were working, they were paid to work there, they qualified. They were also provided with food, and a percentage went back to the government, yes. But everything there went back to the earth. I mean, there was such respect for the land and all that is brought from the land. And the people there were so resourceful. I mean, there wasn't any waste. There wasn't the garbage. There wasn't it. And we have so much we here in America could learn from them rather than go in and have a corporation dictate once the doors are open, this is what you should do. I mean, there's such an enrichment and so much we can learn from them, even though we've been distant from them for 50 years. And I would love to see a program introduced to do that. You know, education. We will be educated by them. I mean, certainly we want to go in there and help them and give them finances, but we should respect and learn from them as well.
I think we will. I think we will. When I gave you the example of the investment, I mean, this is not the U.S. Once the embargo gets lifted, this is not the U.S. telling them this is what you're going to do. This is the Cuban people self-determining and figuring out what they're going to do. Well, that's going to be up to the Cuban people again. Maybe she gave me the money sign. But I appreciate what you're saying, and I think we can learn a lot from the Cuban people.
One more question. Addie, one of my students, I'm a professor here, my class is here. Glad I got to let one of my students. This, I guess, will be the last question.
It's tough being in a room with all the smart people.
No, it's tough. It's rewarding, hopefully.
Thank you, everybody.
No, I meant me. I'm in Congress. All you guys are overqualified.
Is this good? Is this working?
I can hear you. I don't know about
Okay.
everybody else.
I
All
think it's
right. Well, I believe it was Jason who mentioned this first, but I think everybody kind of touched on it, and kind of building off the last question. But we talked about like Cuba's reluctance to rapid shock transition, partly because of the fear that like multinational corporations or the economic superpower countries would take advantage of a very willing and also very inexperienced Cuban market. How real is that fear? And if it is real, and if the U.S. isn't one of these, big bad countries, then what can Cuba and America do to mitigate this fear, to make sure that at the end of the day, it is the interests of the Cuban people that we are serving?
Well, again, it's their ability to self-govern. I mean, I'm not sure where you're going with it. There's not some major conspiracy, and it sounds like the premise that you're starting with is the second the embargo is lifted, millions of dollars will pour in, and it'll corrupt the entire system. When you were down there, did you travel out to the new port that they're building? No. They've invested almost $1 billion, I think was the number, in a new
Brazil
port.
invested $1 billion.
What's that?
Brazil
Well,
invested
sorry.
$1 billion. Yeah.
But here's the thing. Brazil, or whoever invested, might have invested, but they don't own the ground.
No.
I mean, this is basically just a leasehold, which is very interesting. But think about the Cuban people. The people are thinking ahead. They're being visionaries. They're thinking about the fact that you've got these major trade routes that are going to come through the canal. You now have these huge freighters that are bigger than ever before, and they ride deeper in the water than ever before, right? They're holding all these containers. You see them stacked, and they go back and forth. Well, guess what? Because we have failed to update and maintain our ports along the eastern seaboard, these larger ships are not able to effectively move in and out of our ports. Thinking ahead, the Cubans said, guess what? If we build this port in partnership with whomever, we can be the stop-off point. That these large ships come to us, we can serve the function of unloading them and reloading them on smaller vessels.
Exactly.
And we can be this great facilitator along the eastern seaboard. Those are the kinds of things that are going to happen. The Cuban people ultimately will be the ones that decide what their country is going to look like and how they want it to develop. I don't think the fact that you open it up, and what's the definition of opening up? The investment that they've got right now isn't about buying land. Nobody has a fee interest in real property. The government controls everything. So this has got to be up to the Cuban people and their government to self-determine where they're going to go. Again, they look at themselves. I will tell you, this is a crude understanding from a few days sitting across the table with them. I think they truly view themselves as a small China, a tiny opportunity compared to China, right? 11 million versus the size, the population in China and the size of China. But they view themselves as being able, because here was the discussion one day. One of my colleagues sitting at the table referred to the foreign minister, to Cubans as communists. The foreign minister was rather curt when he cut him off. When he said, "What?" And it got very quiet. Nobody responded, and the foreign minister, Bruno, says after a couple of minutes, well, it wasn't that long, it felt like that long, because there was a little tension. He said, "We are not communists. We are socialists." All right? So the government is in transition. They're transitioning apparently to, I shouldn't say apparently, presumably to meet their people, right? Because there's a transition coming from the ground as well. They're in transition. They view themselves as socialists who, and this is the term they used, free market. And by the way, if you use capitalism in Cuba, I realize that over the past 50-some years, capitalism has come to be defined in Cuba as an oligarch. 5 people have all the money, and they make all the decisions, and that's a bad thing, which I would agree if that was truly what capitalism or free markets are supposed to be. But if you talk about free markets, now that's where the home run is. So let's say, and I'm just going to encourage everybody in the room who's concerned about the corruption, the corrupting influence of opening up the economy in Cuba for investment. We've got to respect the Cuban people. We've got to have a little faith in them to understand what it is they want and what they need in their country. I think it's just as dangerous for us to say that we need to have programs to tell you what you need to do. I think we need to trust the Cuban people and create a partner over time as opposed to be the big brother that tells them, you know, this is what you will or won't do. I think that's the only future that'll work. Thank you very much.
On that note, well, join me in thanking. Thank you so
Appreciate
much
it,
for coming.
guys. Yeah, thanks for having me. Sorry, we didn't get a chance to talk. Yeah.
Well, and that also will formally conclude our panel. Thank you all for coming. Join us for a reception right outside of the doors. And join me again in thanking our panelists, Jason Musak, Margaret Jimenez, and Mark Hansen.